When I first came to starting to compose about 10 months ago, I thought it would be a really good idea to learn some music theory. I thought it might help me to understand how music fits together and empower me to do better work as a composer. So I looked for some resources, I looked for some things online, some courses and videos and things like this, and I enrolled in a few of them. But I was really disappointed with what I found, because very often it seemed to be sort of dry, sterile, academic, basic learning and exercises like this is a scale, this is an interval, practice this, name this. And it seemed really sort of separated and divorced from the process and the experience of making music. And I didn't get very far in many of the courses. I pretty much gave up on all of them. And it got me thinking there must be a better way of learning music theory than this. That way might work fine for some people. There might be academically minded people, or people who really like to have foundations in place and feel really sort of secure before moving on to actually doing anything concrete. And that's fine, there's nothing wrong with it. But for others, this process of learning about what other people have observed about music that can really enrich our music should be a sort of wondrous journey of self-discovery. And be totally integrated with the process of expressing ourselves through music. For those of us who come to music with a more intuitive approach, the academic way of learning it can feel like it's reducing something that should be a really beautiful process to cerebral analysis. And it might lead to technically perfect music, but music that's too sterile to evoke any sort of real reaction in people, except admiration from other people who've been similarly technically trained because of the technical side of it. It's a bit like learning quantum physics in Flemish, unless you are Flemish, of course. And there's a brilliant video by 12 Tone that talks about how we don't necessarily need to learn music in the formal sense of, going through the traditional way of learning it. There are good reasons to learn it, and it can help us in our composing, but not necessarily in the formal way. And it's particularly relevant to people of certain personality types. I'm sort of quite interested in the MBTI personality type, and there is a small group of people who have as their main function in terms of how they operate as introverted feeling, and that's backed up with extroverted intuition. And it's a tiny proportion of people who have this combination. But these are people who are disproportionately creative. They're always going to be doing things like writing or music or painting, maybe abstract painting. And they're going to be coming at it in a completely different way. They're going to be working much more on the intuition. And the academic side of it is going to really make it inaccessible for them. So the question becomes, can we find a language that can help people like this to learn music theory effectively in a way that will unlock the full potential of their composing? So this video is about exploring possibilities. I don't have a blueprint. I am definitely not qualified to create one, but it's just throwing out some ideas that, might open some doors, might lead to certain possibilities being explored. I would suggest that in the study of music, the formal side of it would be much lighter. And it wouldn't focus on one particular tradition, but it would look at how music evolved in different parts of the world and what choices each tradition has made. What are the benefits of those choices? And how can we integrate them into our music? For a start, it would mean focusing much less on the musical constructs and structures that were used by European composers in the 18th and 19th centuries. It's not that they weren't geniuses. Someone like Bach was probably, as well as being technically unmatched, Some of his solo violin work and devotional works are the most transcendental and evocative probably of any Western composer since then. But unmatched doesn't mean unparalleled, and there are many different musical traditions around the world, each one with their own Bach. Why would we focus on just one tradition and one period of that tradition, especially when that sort of music isn't really used that much by modern classical composers? And even if it was, we've been so saturated with it in what we've heard that we've probably imbibed it enough that if we learn it more formally, it's going to be really hard to break out of it. There's a really interesting video by Adam Neely called Music Theory and White Supremacy. And when I saw the title, I thought, he's not going to be able to make that stick, that's a bit far. But he actually makes a really good case for it. And I suggest watching that video, it's really interesting. But the wider point is that there are so many traditions around the world, and they've all made different choices and different compromises so that they can have certain strengths. So the European tradition prioritizes harmony, these beautiful, rich musical textures, but it comes at the expense of microtonal scales. It comes at the expense of having what we call just intonation, which is when the notes sound and resonate in their very natural sense, because we have to standardize it. I'm not the best person to explain the scientific rationale behind that, but there is one. Whereas Indian music, for example, has made a different choice. They are not so focused on harmony, they just have a basic accompaniment in one key, but they focus on very intricate melodies with very rich microtonal movements and variations within them. So that's a different compromise that they've made, but they've kept that resonance, that just intonation, that resonance of how the music should actually sound, so it sort of sounds in a slightly higher definition. African music focuses more on rhythm and has that direct connection with the human body and interacts with it in a way that Western and Indian music might not. And it gets you up and it gets you moving and it gets you dancing. You can't dance to Bach. Well, you sort of can to some of his faster concertos if you're in the right mood, but it's not the same thing. So why not get some sort of familiarity with all of these traditions? Why not see them all equally so that we're not having to choose, oh, this is my sort of music and the sort of music I make. We make a different set of compromises maybe for each piece of music that we write, or each section of each piece of music that we write. Or maybe we find some really interesting way to fuse them together and make the best of all worlds. So there's all of these different possibilities. I would suggest that the practical side of composing, which is actually writing music, be right at the center of any training program. Let that drive what needs to be learned and let it drive the learning. That's why we become composers. The impulse to compose doesn't come through study. It's there, it's innate within us. So why not leverage that? Why not start composing, let it expose what our weaknesses are and what we need to learn, and then we fill in the gaps in that way. If we wanted to become a footballer, for example, we wouldn't spend hours or weeks or years in football school before we went out onto the pitch, learning complicated trigonometric maths and physics about the effect of forces on spherical objects. And only when we'd had very controlled practice of very specific parts of that and became really experts, then we'd be allowed to go and play football. It wouldn't work. You'd end up with teams of players who were probably very academically minded, much better suited to the classroom or much better suited to analysing other players' footballing techniques, but who were still convinced that they were extremely proficient in football because of their command of football theory. It wouldn't happen in football. So why do we let that happen in music? What happens in football is that you start practicing. And the further you get and the better you get at playing football, the more your gaps and the gaps in your footballing technique will become apparent. A coach will help you to identify what you need to learn, help you understand how to learn that, and you probably will learn little bits of physics about how balls respond to certain forces and that sort of thing, but you won't learn it in an academic way. You'll learn it in a very practical way that's informed by the way that you already play. Wouldn't that be a sensible approach to music as well? Composing is the fulfilling part. It's what we're here for. And people universally learn better if they're feeling fulfilled. So let's make use of this. Let's base the learning of music around our composing and let it expose what we're not so good at. If my music sounds muddy, I'll want to find out why. With a bit of help, I can sort of explore how to use register more effectively. If I wonder why I find my music, or other people might find my music, a bit boring, then I can explore different ways of introducing variety or interest or surprising the listener and things like this, and let my music drive what I need to learn, and then compose again with an eye on putting some of that learning into practice and refining it further and further each time. So it's an iterative process. We're not skipping any areas or glossing over anything or learning to a less detailed level. We're just doing it in a different way, in a different order, prioritizing a different aspect, and the advantage of that is that you end up with much happier composers who actually make more progress because of their state of mind. It does need good quality personalized feedback and support, so it's not conducive to somebody who comes along with a YouTube channel and a course that you have to subscribe to where you get a bunch of videos and it's supposed to teach you composing. But I'm not sure that those things can ever really make much headway. So these are just some of my own preliminary thoughts, just throwing some of my ideas out there for people to think about if they want to. It would make the acquisition of composing expertise much more accessible to many more people by putting composing itself at the heart of the learning process. Popular music was sort of democratized in a way in the 1950s and 60s when electric instruments became widely available and affordable, and it was easy for people to get into groups and explore music making that way. Nothing like that's happened in classical music until very recently. It's only in the last 20 years or so that we've had computer software that's enabled us to sort of simulate the composing process without actually going through all of the normal stages that composers would have had to go through in the past when that technology wasn't available, to be able to audiate what they wanted to hear from musicians, because there was no other way of doing it. Now we have this instant feedback from digital audio workstations, which means the composing process is much more accessible to many more people. And so people's innate musical intuition and ability no longer has to be limited by the sorts of academic steps that they need to go through and any academic limitations that they might have. And I'm not sure we've totally caught up with those new developments yet. At Heartful Music, we want to play our small part in that change. For the next few videos, we'll be taking one different area of composing. It might be rhythm, it might be counterpoint, it might be register or something like that. And looking at it from the point of view of an intuitive composer, somebody who perhaps doesn't have any music theory background or any musical training, but who wants to develop themselves in these areas. How might they go about it? And we're going to use as an example the only thing that we've got, which is my experience as a composer, very short experience. So we're not going to be uncovering any masterpieces, I can guarantee you of that. But what we will have is a very authentic process of how such things can be learned, how such things can be approached, and hopefully will help people to short circuit a lot of the frustration and difficulty I've had to go through in arriving at what's still quite limited understanding, but it's more than I would otherwise have been able to have. Next time, we're going to go straight in at the deep end and look at counterpoint, including looking at the process I went through to compose this piece that you're hearing behind me now. See you then.